Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. Let's start with the words of Bruno Schulz. The book. Somewhere in the dawn of childhood, at the first daybreak of life, the horizon grew bright from its gentle light. The book lay full of glory on father's desk, and my father, quietly engrossed in it, with a saliva-moistened finger, patiently rubbed the back of those decals until the blind paper started to blur, to grow opaque, to rave with a blessed premonition, and suddenly peel off in tufts of tissue paper, to reveal a border with peacock eyes surrounded by lashes. And one's gaze descended, fainting into the virginal dawn of divine colors, the wondrous dampness of the purest azures. Oh, that abrading of the film! Oh, that invasion of radiance! Oh, blessed spring! Oh, Father! Bruno Schulz, the author of this passage, who is the main subject for our first episode of the summer of 2021, has enjoyed a double afterlife as the author of two small but potent collections of stories in Polish, Cinnamon Shops, published in 1934, and the Hourglass Sanatorium, published in 1938, but also as an artist and writer who has become a major figure in the literary mythologies of such prominent post-war Jewish authors as Philip Roth, Cynthia Ozick, Danilo Kiš, David Grossman, Norman Raven, Jonathan Safran Foer, Nicole Krauss, and Maxim Biller. Meanwhile, Schulz's work has spawned an extensive critical and creative literature in Poland, comprising hundreds of scholarly and critical publications, and inspiring creative writers and artists of many fields, such as Witold Gombrowicz, Tadeusz Kantor, Wojciech Jerzy, Ewa Kuryluk, Olga Tokarczuk, Agata Tuchinska, Stefan Chwin, and many more. Emerging from the rich multicultural context of Austro-Hungarian Galicia, not to be confused with Galicia in Spain, it should be no surprise that Schulz's multiple identities continue to provoke fascination and controversy. Today, we're also seeing two new major currents emerging in how we read Schulz. One comes from new discoveries, as scholars largely based in Ukraine take an interest in Schulz as they work through archival materials from Schulz's era. And as those archives are digitized and become available through the internet, the other is considering Schulz in the Jewish modernist context of his own day, rather than in the post-Holocaust legacy among the international community of Jewish writers, or strictly in the Polish language modernist context of writers like Witkacz and Gombrowicz. And this Polish-Jewish modernist current will be our main focus for today. But first, some background. Schulz was born in 1892 in the town of Drohobycz, which is today part of western Ukraine, but was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father, Jakub, who died in 1915, was a fabric merchant with a dry goods store on the market square, lost eventually in a fire. And his mother, Henrietta, née Kumerker, who died in 1931, is said to have come from a wealthy family. Drohobycz and the nearby town of Borysław were the center of one of the world's main oil-producing regions. Bruno Schulz's brother Isidor was an engineer and oil executive who contributed substantially to the family's upkeep until his untimely death in 1935. He also built movie theaters in Drohobycz and Warsaw, contributed to the funds for the publication of Cinnamon Shops, and is said to have funded the Jewish orphanage in Drohobycz. What is important for American readers to know is that Drohobycz was not a shtetl. It was not a major cultural capital like Lviv, today known as Lviv, or Warsaw, say, but it was a center of wealth with elegant mansions, people who owned books and traveled and purchased art. Oil fueled not only the lamps, but also the wealth of the Vienna Rothschilds, and it was an important enough place for Emperor Franz Joseph I to visit during his tour of Galicia in 1880, a fact that left a powerful imprint on Schulz's imagination. It had a train station, several synagogues, Catholic and Orthodox churches, most notably the 15th century wooden church of St. George with its onion spires, and covered from floor to ceiling with icons, a naive painting of biblical scenes, which must have been of interest to Schulz. Drohobycz was near the pre-war Jewish resort of Truskawiec, which became a Soviet resort known as Truskawiec in Russian after the Second World War. Schulz's family spent summers in Truskawiec, and when the narrator begins his story, August, the opening of cinnamon shops, with the words, "In July, my father left to take the waters, abandoning my mother, my older brother, and me as prey to the dazzling summer days that were white with heat." And when he writes about the sanatorium, of course, in his second cycle of stories, Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass, or the Hourglass Sanatorium, it is important to know that this was the village of sanatoria that Schulz actually knew. Petroleum was considered something of a panacea. Before crude oil was refined to make petrolatum, or Vaseline as it's commonly known, people would put crude oil on their skin. And water from wells adjacent to the oil fields was considered to have beneficial health properties. Even today, one may visit Truskawiec to bathe in and drink naftusha, under the guidance of a trained balneologist. I've tasted naftusha, but can't claim to have immersed myself adequately to have noticed any health benefits. Schulz is often characterized as being so wedded to the imagery of Drohobycz that he could never leave. But this was perhaps more a matter of necessity than desire. He was exposed to the wider art world in Vienna around 1917 to 18 as a student. As an artist, he had an exhibition at the Zachęta Gallery in Warsaw in 1922 and showed his works in Wilno, Lviv, and Borysław, as well as Drohobycz, becoming known to the avant-gardist Stanisław Ignacy or Witkacy, whom he would visit at his home in Zakopane in southern Poland in 1925. And there he met the Polish Yiddishist poet and critic Debora Vogel, who would become his main intellectual interlocutor and his fiancée for a time. He traveled to Warsaw with his early manuscripts to visit the prominent psychological realist novelist Zofia Naukowska, who recommended the work for publication by Rui, and while in Warsaw he wrote critical essays and corresponded with Witkacy and Gombrowicz in the literary press. He visited Stockholm in 1936 and spent 3 weeks in Paris in 1938. Though he allegedly had Aryan papers provided by friends in connection with Naukowska that might have allowed him to escape Nazi-occupied Drohobycz during the war, he stayed. Despite his extensive reliance on imagery from Drohobycz in his work, we also know that he wrote several letters requesting leave from his job teaching shop and mechanical drawing at the Gymnasium, the academic high school, so that he could build his connections in Lviv and other European cities and grow as a writer and an artist. He had family and his subsequent fiancée, Józefina Szelinska, after having been rejected by Debora Vogel's family, in Drohobycz, and it's reasonable to imagine that he did not want to abandon them. It is also not clear whether he may have thought that he could survive the German occupation. Schulz was protected by Felix Landau, a Gestapo officer from Vienna who took an interest in Schulz's talents as a painter and employed him, presumably without compensation except for his life, to paint scenes from fairy tales that would later be discovered in what was to have been the children's room of the Landau home. Landau was known for his cruelty, shooting Jews in the street from his balcony, and it is alleged that he shot a Jewish dentist who was being protected by a rival Nazi officer, Karl Günther. There are conflicting stories about Schulz's death during a street action, as it's called, known as Black Thursday, on November 19, 1942. The most well-known version has Günther executing Schulz in the street in retaliation for Landau's action, stating, "You shot my Jew, I shot your Jew." With differences in detail, this story is told by Schulz's biographer Jerzy Ficowski, author Henrik Rinberg, and by the late Alfred Schreier, Schulz's last student who remained in Drohobycz. Another former student of Schulz, Zev Fleischer, interviewed by David Grossman in Israel, claimed that Schulz was shot in the street just like any other Jew, and it would have been out of place for an officer of Günther's rank to be shooting people in the street. We know that the rivalry existed, and that the death occurred on this day, and it is a very dramatic story, but I think it is better that Schulz be remembered for what he did, and for his art and for his writing, and not for what was done to him by the Nazis. So, For today's discussion, how Jewish was Bruno Schulz? For some, it may be enough that Schulz died as a Jew from a Nazi bullet. Schulz wrote in Polish rather than Yiddish, and Isaac Bashevis Singer once explained in an interview with Philip Roth the tension around this fact. We Yiddish writers, he wrote, looked at them as people who had left their roots and culture and become a part of Polish culture, which we considered younger and perhaps less important than our culture. They felt that we Yiddish writers were writing for ignorant people, poor people, people without education, while they were writing for readers who went to universities. So we both had good reason to despise each other. Though the truth is, they had no choice, and we had no choice. They didn't know Yiddish, we didn't know Polish. Although I was born in Poland, Polish was not as close to me as Yiddish. As Singer knew, and as Debora Vogel wrote in a letter to Schulz, it was no easy task to be a modernist while writing in Yiddish, because traditional Jews were not so interested in modernism, and Polish avant-gardists didn't know Yiddish. Singer suspects that this condition of being a Jewish writer writing in the dominant language forced Kafka and Schulz into an absurdism that is excellent and provocative, but was kind of an escape from writing in a more realist mode. He writes, Singer, there is great mockery in the writing of both Schulz and of Kafka. Although in Kafka the mockery is more hidden, I think that Schulz had enough power to write real serious novels, but instead often wrote a kind of parody. And I think basically he developed this style because he was not really at home, neither home among the Poles nor at home among the Jews. Before we pick up this topic of Bruno Schulz and his relationship to Jewish modernity in Poland with our guest, I'd like to thank you all, again, for following our series, sharing links to our videos on social media, and subscribing. If you check the YouTube description down below, you can find our playlist with all our previous episodes. If you like what you hear, please click the thumbs up and leave us a comment if you can. And if you haven't already done so, please hit the subscribe button and show our sponsors at the Polish Cultural Institute New York that you are interested and want to hear more of what scholars, critics, translators, and I hope eventually authors have to say about Polish literature, its history, and its present. So let me now introduce my guest and my friend, Professor Karen Underhill. Karen Underhill is Associate Professor of Polish Literature and Polish Jewish Studies in the Department of Polish, Russian, and Lithuanian Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research at the intersection of Polish and Jewish cultures and literatures focuses on 20th century Polish and Yiddish literatures, diasporic modernisms, and Poland as a multilingual and pluralist space of encounter. She is the author of Bruno Schulz and Galician Jewish Modernity, forthcoming from the University of Indiana Press. Her current research explores changing narratives of Poland's Jewish past and modern literary forms that arise at the intersection of theology and materialism, writing in the third language. Welcome, Karen.
Hello, David. Thank you so much for having me.
Great having you here. So, what's your approach to Schulz in this Galician Jewish modernist context?
I'd like to try thinking of it in terms of two constellations. One, a constellation of factors, social, political, and cultural factors that really shaped the life, the Jewish experience in Galicia in the early 20th century. And I'd like to lay out 8 factors that I think can help us to think about that context out of which Schulz's diasporic form of Jewish writing emerges. And another constellation that helped me to think about Schulz's work is a constellation of key images around which he built his poetic landscape. So I'd like to start by presenting some of those factors that I think help us to think about a specifically Galician Jewish context. So the first of those would definitely be multilingualism, the multilingualism of Jewish communities. We could think about the living of daily life in a kind of translational state. Galician Jews of Schulz's generation were effectively quadrilingual. Daily life in this region was lived in Yiddish, Polish, German, Hebrew, sometimes Ukrainian. So we could imagine the living of life in a kind of fluid state of translation. a constant movement across the boundaries of language as a daily experience. So in this context, individual subjectivity becomes inseparable from this movement in and out of, we could say, overlapping cultural imaginaries. And in Schulz's work, and also in his conversations with Debora Vogel, who will be his fiancée, as you mentioned, and the primary influence on the development of his aesthetic, the question of matter and form receives a great deal of attention. And I know that's something that you'd like us to look at together today. For Schulz, fluid, malleable matter dons and sheds successive masks. In a way, this is a beautiful metaphor for a life lived in multiple languages. With language as the form and the individual, the human being, as that malleable matter, spirit, or energy that occupies these forms and shines through them. So multilingualism as a defining factor of this environment. A second factor, that the fact that the Polish language was becoming in this region, or had already become in Galicia specifically, a Jewish language. So Polish as a Jewish language, which could challenge some of the assumptions that underlie even the statements that you read by Isaac Bashevis Singer. They can challenge and problematize the dividing lines that have structured some of the way we think about Polish Jewish studies, literature in the Polish language by Jewish writers. So this process of Polish becoming a Jewish language was accelerated by a full 2 generations in Galicia because of the granting of a measure of autonomy to Galicia by the Austrian Empire. So with Schulz and younger than him, Debora Vogel and Rochel Korn and Rochel Auerbach's generation, what you see is a kind of precursor of the functioning in a Jewish intellectual and cultural context in the Polish language that can, I think, really change the way we understand what it means for him to have chosen to write in that language. The third factor I want to mention is what critics already at the time that Schulz was living called the language wars. The fact that for Jewish writers and political activists, language choice became an index of one's political and spiritual affiliation. It was both a motivating force and also a divisive factor within Jewish literary and intellectual communities. So this is referred to by scholars Hona Shmerek, Benjamin Harshav, and later as the language wars, or part of a modern Jewish revolution. The choice of what language to write in was connected to nothing less than an existential question. How do you envision the survival, continuity, and flourishing of Jewish culture? The continuity of Jewishness, of Jewish people. So within a secular context, for example, Yiddish became tied to the politics of the Bund, the concept of Doigkeit, here-ness. The idea that Jews belong in Eastern Europe, they are European. Their distinctive Ashkenazi culture is native to Poland, to this place, and they should remain working with other minorities and with sympathetic Polish comrades for a politics of multiplicity that protects all minorities. In a religious context, Yiddish is associated with modern Hasidism, which is thriving in Poland in the interwar period. It's a living language in the home, a language of study. Hebrew becomes associated with Zionisms, multiple Zionisms, both cultural and political. The commitment to an idea of developing a Jewish life in Palestine. In the case of political Zionism, a commitment to encourage emigration away from Poland. The founding of a new homeland in Palestine that could become a state. The use of Polish, and that's what you're introducing here. And that's what we have in the case of Schulz. We're in the realm of Schulz. It was, at the time that he was writing, associated within Jewish communal discourse, within the debates and arguments that were taking place among intellectuals on the pages of journals, newspapers, and in public debates. It was associated with assimilation. It was criticized as evidence of a desire to blend in with Polish culture. But I would propose that what Schulz's work represents is a rejection of that premise. It problematizes it absolutely. It refuses those linguistic categories and divisions. A fourth factor that I want to put on the table is the fact that wasn't necessarily talked about within the context of studies of Polish modernism. And that is that what you had going on in Polish or Galician prior to Polish independence, Russian prior to Polish independence cities, is Jewish majority cultural environments that existed on historically Polish lands. The fact that it was possible to live in Poland one's daily life in a fully Jewish environment, a fully trilingual or quadrilingual Jewish environment. And this is true from the smallest shtetl to the major cultural centers, Warsaw, Vilna, Łódź, in this case, Lviv. Shifts the way we might think about a cultural production in the Polish language if it's produced within a Jewish majority intellectual context and conversation. A fifth factor, with this Galician generation that begins to acquire Polish as its native language, and then after World War I and Poland's emergence as an independent state, this will become true throughout Poland, with the fact of Polish becoming a Jewish language. What we find is the creation, the development, emerging of a new Polish Jewish cultural imaginary that is a kind of total second track of Polish culture that in a sense begins to diverge from the Polish Catholic cultural imaginary and from Polish Catholic literary tradition, or even from secular Polish tradition. And here Schulz readers might think of his words about a kind of text that leads them into a second illegal track of time. 6, of course, this context is defined, and Galicia is a seat of this by the rise of competing forms of Jewish nationalism across an entire spectrum, from cultural Zionism to political Zionism, folkism, Yiddishism, and Bundism, with their ethos of Doakite or here-ness, modern Hasidism, as I mentioned, and Orthodoxy, and across this whole spectrum, patriotic identification with the new state of Poland. So with one's European civic identity as a Polish citizen. These categories are not separate. Again, work like Schulz's blurs the lines between them, but scholars are discovering increasingly, are discussing how much movement there is across these lines. We should mention assimilation as part of that spectrum. But in the interwar period, this is a very rare phenomenon. This is a tiny portion of the spectrum. And I think that's important, because one of the things that Schulz's work helps us to do is to break with that concept, that assumption that writing in Polish was an indicator of assimilation into non-Jewish Polish culture. Another factor, a 7th factor, which shapes the trajectory of all these developments, is the rise of ethno-nationalism and with it anti-Semitism and proto-fascism in the early 20th century. But even the centrality and the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism to the intellectual and communal context of interwar Poland is something that has been underexplored and understudied in the context of Polish literary studies. So this one factor with which we are so familiar, that anti-Semitism had a huge influence on the Jewish experience in Eastern Europe, has not been a major factor in thinking about Schulz's work. 8th, this is a bit of a detail, but I think a fascinating one in terms of its significance for scholarship of diasporic cultural forms. And that is that in this Galician context, we can talk about the orientation of Galician Jews, like Schulz, towards multiple cultural centers. So if in post-colonial studies, we often think of the dynamics between center and periphery, the Galician Jewish context challenges that model productively, because an artist of Schulz's generation is oriented towards literally 3, and at least 3, cultural and intellectual centers: German language, literature, and philosophy, Polish culture, literature, and history, and what was for many Jewish writers the dominant center, deterritorialized center, Jewish textual tradition, and also Jewish cultural and communal life. So in the context of Galicia and Poland, Jews coming into the 20th century, the hierarchy that we normally associate with minority-majority cultural interactions was, if anything, reversed. And you sort of referred to this in the statement you made, that you read by Isaac Bashevis Singer. Jewish culture could be experienced as older than, as superior to Polish culture, and as really an organizing focus, a cultural node toward which their conversation is directed in a variety of languages.
That is a very rich constellation of ideas about language and matter and how the manifold ways that these things represent themselves in Jewish life in Galicia. And I'd like to maybe we can move to seeing how these things work themselves out in Schulz's own text. So I thought we might look at his treatise on mannequins, which we talked about a little before our meeting today. Let me see if I can find this. Now, the treatise on mannequins, this is kind of interesting, is the story is told from, this is from Cinnamon Shops, the story is told from a child's perspective. And what we're witnessing is the father, Jakub, giving a kind of oration, and his audience consists of remember, he's like Schulz's own father. He operates he's a fabric merchant, and he's speaking to Adela, who is a kind of dominant woman in this context, and seamstresses who work in the shop. So there are three women that he's speaking to, and they're of the working class. They're not necessarily terribly interested in his long orations, but they work for him, so they put up with it. He starts out. Let me just read a couple of short bits, if that's okay. "The figures in waxworks, dear ladies," he began, "are pathetic church fair parodies of mannequins." He's talking about mannequins. And we should also say that treatise, the word in Polish is traktat, which is like a tractate of the Talmud. We call those traktaty as well. And he's talking about the matter of waxwork figures. "The figures in waxworks, dear ladies," he began, "are pathetic church fair parodies of mannequins. But be wary of treating them lightly, even in this form. Matter knows no jokes. It is always full of tragic dignity. Who dares to think that it is possible to play with matter, to shape it for the sake of a joke, that the joke will not grow into it, will not instantly eat into it like fate, like predestination? Can you sense the pain, the dumb captive suffering, the suffering embedded in matter of this grotesque hag that does not know why it exists, why it must endure in this form, this parody imposed on it by an act of violence? Do you understand the power of expression, of form, of appearance, the tyrannical willfulness with which it throws itself upon a defenseless log and masters it like its own tyrannical controlling soul? You impose upon some head made of tufts of hair and canvas an expression of anger, and you leave it once and for all with that anger, that convulsion, that tension, locked up with a blind fury for which there was no outlet. The crowd laughs at this parody. Weep, my ladies, over your own fate. Seeing this misery of imprisoned matter, tormented matter, matter that does not know who it is and why it exists, nor where that gesture that has been imposed on it once and for all is leading it." And let me read another passage later on, dealing with this question of this matter in the tailor's mannequins. "Who knows," he said, "how many suffering, crippled, fragmentary forms of life there are? How artificially pieced together is the life of wardrobes and tables violently hammered together with nails, the life of crucified wood, of the silent martyrs to cruel human ingenuity. The terrible transplantation of alien races of wood that hate one another, they're being shackled together into a single unhappy individual." What do you think he's doing here with this, he's taking this form of this philosophical treatise, and then he's talking about this mundane object in a tailor shop.
Wow. I mean, you went to I think, to a passage that maybe perhaps more than almost any other that he's written allows his exploration of the physical world of matter, the world of raw materials, of objects, furniture, mannequins, to resonate with the experience of the individual in early 20th century Europe. So, here we have that movement back and forth between a philosophical thinking about matter and form and a reflection on the very real world experience within a political context, with individuals who now, in a post-World War I context of emerging nation states, are literally changing the forms of their citizenship, of their identity, taking on the cloak of Polishness as a new form of citizenship. We have some examples of how Schulz's work was read in the period when it came out. And this is from Cinnamon Shops, published in 1934, by members of his Galician Jewish community in Lviv. And Rochel Korn, the poet, also from the Lviv region, wrote a review for the Yiddish literary journal Literarische Blätter of Cinnamon Shops, in which this passage, she pulled it out, it spoke to her. And I think, and it's not necessarily as much attention drawn to this passage in reviews by non-Jewish critics. And I think because it resonated with conversations that were happening within a Jewish context and within the Jewish world. I have some passages that I've translated from that review that I think could shed light on both this question of matter and form and how it related to conversations that Schulz was having with his Jewish community and context, but also how it can help us think about an organizing principle in Schulz's aesthetic, which is the idea of golus, or exile/diaspora. What would a writing in diaspora from coming out of his specific Polish, Jewish, Galician context look like? And I think that drives and motivates him as he searches for a form for his literature. So
we should say for our readers that golos is the Yiddish word that comes from the Hebrew galut, which means the diaspora. So that whole concept of golos nationalism, living the diaspora, is a kind of keyword for understanding Schulz's context. If I could intervene before we read the Korn passage, it's interesting that when I read that passage, I think of how, on the one hand, he's adopting this formal, he's putting his father in, adopting this formal high Jewish style of giving, of reading the tractate, of reading a treatise, and but making it about something totally trivial, like furniture or something like that, which sounds like, when Singer says, well, what he's doing is kind of a parody, but he's doing a parody. But I think what you bring to this that's interesting is that, well, it's, maybe it has, like, you might say maybe it has the form of parody, but it actually comes out of some actual, discussions and considerations that are going on within this this Lviv intellectual Jewish society. So go ahead and read from Korn's review, your translation. I think that sheds a lot of light that I think many readers of Schulz aren't necessarily aware of.
She writes, while reading this short novella in which the imaginary takes on the fixed forms of reality, one has the impression that Schulz wants to lead the enslaved word out of its ages-long gullus. Schulz breaks down the hardened shell that had, over the course of years, formed layers around the kernel of the word, and restores to it its own meaning, its form, sound, and aroma. Entering between the covers of the book of Genesis, Schulz has found a way through the spirit of words to the essence of things. Suddenly we glimpse a world, a life that we had passed by indifferently, labeling it with the name nature mort, a world that lives according to its own laws ancient laws engraved in the nervous system of the page, but in the shape of a warning. And we become a witness to a bloody struggle for hegemony and equal rights waged between man and violated nature. This is not a grotesque stage play of Andersen's fairy tales for children. It is a revelation. And then she goes on to translate into Yiddish the same passage that you read. Who knows how many suffering, crippled, fragmentary forms of life there are.
What do you think she means when she says that Schulz wants to lead the enslaved word out of its ages-long golus? Because I think that's the key to that passage.
Schulz had this very evocative concept of what he called an obraz talisman, a kind of image talisman or a picture riddle. This is an image that contains opposing interpretations, versions, or faces within itself. An obraz talisman for him is an unresolvable image, an image for contemplation, like a koan. It could be a loaded word that contains multiple facets. And he organized his work around this kind of picture talisman, encounter, a confrontation between unreconcilable opposites. So golus is such a word, such a paradigm. First, it has a dual valence of both exile and diaspora. It has negative and positive implications. Jews are living among the nations, but golus is also the place, the only place of the flourishing of East European Jewish culture. Galicia is the only place that Schulz's art could have come from, golus. And he reflects on that very openly in his essay on Lillian. The word golus also straddles the border between history and myth. It describes a historical reality, the reality of Jewish history, the Jewish condition, but it also functions as a metaphor, a kind of organizing paradigm within Jewish culture, and specifically within Lurianic Kabbalah, which was popularized in Eastern European Jewish culture through Hasidism. In Lurianic tradition, golus describes the ontological nature of all matter, and that's what we start to hear in Korn's review, the ontological nature of the created world, which exists in a state of exile and fragmentation in need of repair. And this image was available to writers like Schulz and Korn. It was a part of traditional culture, folk culture, that the modernist writer could draw on. So a small sentence like Korn's sets up all of these resonances for her readership. But I think it's very interesting to look at this statement in the context I mentioned earlier of language choice. So Korn herself is a Yiddishist. She's writing for the leading Yiddish literary journal. And this gives her phrase a specific connotation related to what it means for her readers that Schulz, this Polish Jewish writer that they don't know of, has not chosen to write in Yiddish. For her, his very Jewish literature with his work, which is, she's saying, is worthy of attention. His poetry remains in exile in the Polish language, as it were. And this is at a time when writers felt called to make an existential choice to establish their commitment to Jewish culture and Jewish continuity. So in a way, this amazing line kind of reactivates the debates of that time. It becomes even more interesting because Rachel Korn is one of several members of the Lviv literary milieu whose native language, her mother tongue, was Polish, like Schulz's, but who made an active choice to become Yiddish writers, even though they couldn't write in Yiddish. And that was a difficult choice that required learning Yiddish as a literary language. Korn's husband helped her to do it. According to her translator, Seymour Levitan, her decision was a direct outgrowth or a response to the 1918 pogrom in Lviv. Debora Vogel also made this choice with the help of and encouragement of Rochel Auerbach, who became her close friend and actually translated her earlier poems into Yiddish before she was able to do so. So these are issues that Schulz and Vogel would absolutely have been discussing before Schulz wrote the letters that would become Cinnamon Chops. So, and there's no question that in this post-World War I environment of increasingly polarized ethno-nationalisms, the choice to write in Yiddish or Hebrew is a clear affirmation that one is part of the Jewish nation. But here's a fascinating dynamic specific to this Galician generation. In order to become Yiddish writers, Korn and Vogel have to essentially go into a kind of voluntary linguistic exile themselves. They write in exile from their native tongue, Polish. So in Korn's statement, I also hear a kind of reflection on language as a place of exile. And the individual can't the individuals in exile in whatever language they use. But going back to Golis and your question about Korn's lines, interestingly, her language in that review echoes very closely the metaphoric language that Schulz himself used to describe his poetic practice. So in the much cited essay, Mythicization of Reality, or the mythicization of reality, or the mythologizing of reality, as it's been variously translated, he precisely talked about writing poetry as a process of leading the word out of its exile, as it were, in everyday language. And for him, language has fallen in everyday language. It exists in its mosaic pieces, profane fragments or shards of some primordial language that we use to communicate. Here, he's directly borrowing from the Lurianic Kabbalistic paradigm of creation and adapting it to his secular or post-theological theory of poetics. Language is pictured in that essay as having a longing to remember its divine origins. And through his poetry, the poet responds to this longing and returns language to its home in myth.
Maybe we should read from that passage from the Mythicization of Reality. So at the beginning of the essay, which is translated as the mythologizing of reality in Walter Arndt's translation, Schulz writes, "The essence of reality is meaning or sense. What lacks sense is, for us, not reality. Every fragment of reality lives by virtue of partaking in a universal sense. The old cosmogonists expressed this by the statement, 'In the beginning was the Word.' The nameless does not exist for us. To name something means to include it in some universal sense. The isolated word as a mosaic piece is a late product, an early result of technology. The primeval word was a shimmering aura, a myocenia, as you mentioned before, circling around the sense of the world, was a great universal whole. The word in its common usage today is only a fragment, remnant of some former all-embracing integral mythology. That is why it possesses a tendency to grow back, to regenerate and complete itself in full meaning. The life of the word consists in tensing and stretching itself toward 1,000 connections, like the cut-up snake in the legend, whose pieces search for each other in the dark. This 1,000-formed but integral organism of the word was torn apart into syllables, sounds, everyday speech, and in these new forms, adapted to practical needs, it was handed down to us as a handy code of communication. In this way, the life of the word, its development was shunted onto a new track, the track of mundane life, and subjected to new rules of order. But if for some cause the restrictions of pragmatic reality loosen their grip, if the word, released from their restraint, is left to itself and restored to its own laws, then a regression, a reversal of current occurs. The word strives for its former connections, wants to complete itself with sense, and this striving of the word toward its matrix, its yearning for the primeval home of words we call poetry. Poetry happens when short circuits of sense occur between words, a sudden regeneration of the primeval myths."
Thank you. I want to mention that that word sense also translates as meaning. Strives for the home of meaning. But also there's a place in that translation where it talks about this shimmering hole swirling around the meaning of the world. And in fact, I think I've seen that what he really wrote on that manuscript was światła, around the meaning of the light. So there's something for us to ponder. But I want to return for a second to something that I think really worth noticing, which is that in this image, because we're talking about Golis and him using the paradigm, this Kabbalistic paradigm of Golis. In this image, return from Golis isn't a one-time event that happens in history. It's absolutely not. It's part of the structure of language. And in the Kabbalistic paradigms, the structure of the universe and the structure of all meaning. So return of language from its Golis is a continual process of repair that the poet takes part in. So in a post-theological, and I want to call this kind of writing and this kind of modernist writing at the border between theology and secular or materialist thought as post-theological. So in a kind of post-theological sense, it could be thought of as a continual process. What is this return? It could be thought of as a process of recalling mythical meaning that's present in our culture, in our language, or recalling the intimation of divinity that's always present just behind the surface of our language, or behind the very fact that we have language. And this kind of binary structure with the primordial word and the fallen word is very characteristic of Schulz. He sets up these dialectical talismans, these obraz talismans, picture riddles. Here the picture riddle has two poles: the primordial world, the swirling source of all meaning, the primordial word, the swirling source of all meaning, versus everyday language, the broken shards, sacred versus profane, pure potentiality. That's also substance, matter, or spirit in other places in his work, as yet unrealized in history, versus form, which is fixed, tangible, realized in history, language that is used in everyday speech. What is implied in the paradigm of Golis? To me, what's implied in Schulz's use of it is to keep open the imagination of a place of pure potentiality, of a childlike openness of perception, of a possibility of not being locked within the boundaries that are imposed upon one. So a kind of childlike fluidity, a space before matter, before the individual, before the imagination, before the culture has been locked into a specific form. So this idea of Golis is rather a mythical structure in Schulz's work that continues to inform his poetics. And I think he sees that as a mythical structure that has informed Jewish textual tradition for centuries, for millennia, in diaspora. And I think that what happens there is he says, but there is potential to bring forward a vital, affirmative Jewish form of literary expression by bringing forward some of these organizing mythical structures. The structure of Golis not as a problem that needs to be resolved in history, which would be the political Zionist solution, but as a mythical structure for thinking the nature of reality and the nature of language that actually shouldn't be resolved. The tension between everyday language and the realm of myth, between human everyday experience and the mythical plane onto which poetry connects it, needs to be kept open. So diaspora is an essential structure for his writing, and he seems to suggest an essential structure for a vital art. Schulz was always looking for a form of expression that he called adekvatne, that could be adequate to or commensurate with his specific historical experience. There's a line in his essay about E.M. Lillian where he's talking about Lillian, but again, he's absolutely talking about himself and about what he aspires to, what he tried to do in his Polish writing. He writes this book, and he's talking about a graphic book. He's talking about Lillian's illustrations for Judah. This book was at once and at the same time his first attempt to immerse himself in the world of his tribe's past, and an attempt to recover his mythic fatherland. He gave bodily form to the myth that his epoch and the community out of which he came could afford. For Lillian, the matter of reactivating Jewish myth, of reawakening it and bringing it closer to his contemporary Europeanized generation, appears as a question of giving expression to one's own content, to those reserves of ore slumbering in the depths of the collective consciousness, within the forms of national European art. And he writes, he adopted its artistic equipment. He's talking about European art forms. Like here, it could be Polish modernist experimentation with form. He adopted its artistic equipment, form, and contents, but he poured into them an altogether new and different spirit. This is a spirit of pure poetry and high idealism, the spirit of optimism and affirmation. In this way, his contribution has entered into Jewish culture as an eternal and indestructible asset. If you would allow me, I could go back to the passage you first read at the opening of the show, at the top of the show, from the short story Kshenga, and just talk a little bit more about that. Would that be okay?
Yes, the book, as it's translated.
I'm sorry, the book. Yes,
that's fine.
The book. It's an amazing passage, and so here Kshenga, the book, again, is this kind of obraz talisman, this dialectical image that combines sacred and profane into one. It's the book, but it's also, it's the sacred book, but it's the original book, but it's also to be found in the most degraded, profane fragments.
So it's interesting. I mean, bringing up Kshenga, that before you talked about the distinction in the Jewish context between a sefer and a buch, right, in Yiddish, right, a holy book versus an ordinary book. And Polish has this distinction too, which is the distinction between a księga, which is like a great book or a religious book, and a książka, which is an everyday book. And that Schulz maintains that distinction. And it's important to mention this, I think, for our audience, because it's one of those things that's very hard to catch in translation.
Mm-hmm.
If you were reading it in Polish, you would instantly notice the difference between księga and książka. But in the translation, like for instance, what Madeleine Levine does is she makes that distinction between the capital B book and the small b book. And I thought that was interesting. I mean, the book that's being described there in Kshenga, that he's calling a holy book, is in fact the opposite of a holy book, in the way that the mannequins, seem like unworthy of a religious treatise or a tractate, right? The book is in fact, it's some kind of a catalog. It's like the back part of a catalog that they use to wrap fish. And what he sees in it is this advertisement for a hair tonic, which was ubiquitous throughout Europe. The surrealists, the modernists, the Dadaists were very fascinated by this absurd description, and had a picture of a long woman with long hair, and her name was Anna Cilag, and she would start out, "I, Anna Cilag, had a poor growth of hair," and it was translated into many languages, including Yiddish and Polish and German and others. And that is the holy book that he sees Adela, this kind of dominant woman who's a woman figure in the Schulz household, looking at, and he looks over her shoulder, and he says that he's looking over her shoulder in part just to take in her scent. But then he sees the book and he's fascinated. He's reading over Adela's shoulder, right? And he's looking at this, the story of, I, Anna Cilag, born in Karlovice in Moravia, had a scant growth of hair. And then she talks about how she put on this formula on her head, and then her hair grew like down to her ankles in the way that it is in the advertisement. And that, she became a kind of a marvel in the village, and everybody, came from near and far to see her. And so at the end of this section of the story, the book, Schulz says, "I read this story over Adela's shoulder, and suddenly a thought struck me, and I was completely aflame from its touch. So this was the book, capital B, Kshenga. Its final pages, its unofficial supplement, a rear annex full of waste and rubbish. Fragments of a rainbow were turning around in the swirling wallpaper. I yanked the scrap of paper from Adela's hand, and in a voice that refused to obey me, I breathed out, 'Where did you get this book, small b, Książka?' And then she says, 'Fool,' she said, shrugging her shoulders, 'it's always here, and we tear out pages from it every day for meat from the butcher's stalls and for your father's breakfast.' I think what's interesting about moments like this in Schulz, and that's very Schulzian, is this juxtaposition of something that's trash and something that has a kind of splendor, right, has a kind of ethereal quality. And that's maybe what he's talking about when, talking about how poetry reconnects these things.
It seems to be precisely an argument at the heart of what Schulz is doing, that the sacred can only be found through entering into an exegesis of the profane, that these exist in a kind of inescapable dialectical tension, that it's by entering into this world, this worldly material and matter, that one has what to redeem, that one has what to transform, has what to reconnect with the realm of myth, and that there is no other place but in the world of form, but in history, what Walter Benjamin might call in nature history, in fallen matter. There is no other place to find what can be redeemed and transformed into truth.
As you describe it, if exegesis is this kind of constant state, then the resolution is kind of like the Messiah that never comes. I mean, that it's like that you never arrive, quite at the end, and that's maybe what Schulz's enigmatic language sets up for us. I mean, that we're always kind of, it's such a small body of text, and yet there's so many of us who are like working on it and trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? What is this this very rich body of that fits in like in this book, right? I mean, this is most of it, right? And then we're discovering a couple of new things every once in a while, like you mentioned, these wonderful texts that are being uncovered by Ukrainian scholars, particularly, who have access to archives and have the time to look through them, who aren't traveling and are on kind of a tight schedule and so forth. That like we do, and if we go to Drohobycz or something like that, they live in Drohobycz. I mean,
amazing archival work though that's being done by people associated with Stanislav Boszek's research group.
Yes,
and that is turning up, and hopefully will turn up more amazing discoveries. But this has just been an invaluable revitalization of the field of Schulz studies.
Yeah, and it's what we're discovering is that there's Juvenalia, like the story Undula that you mentioned, which is not even a complete story. So maybe there's more of it to discover, and there's maybe more. And it was written under a pseudonym, Marcelli Veron. So maybe there's more pseudonymous work under other other names that that we can attribute to Schulz, because the language is so similar, and we know we can define when it was published and so forth. But in terms of like this question of of there ever being a resolution to to all this exegesis, is that maybe that's kind of what Schulz gives us, is this he gives us this opportunity to be in this state of reading, of constant reading, and trying to figure out, trying to make the connections that have been laid out for us, or that are there somehow underlying the text.
This idea of the encounter over the text, of reading, I just runs through so many aspects of Schulz's personal biography and of his work. So, just picking up off what you're saying, there's a lot of his graphic works which portray two what could be yeshiva students walking in the streets, engaged in discussion, engaged in an active interpretation, or individuals sitting around a table engaged in an act of reading. In his life, his aesthetics takes shape through an act of engaged interpretation, through an encounter between him and Vogel, walking through the streets. He often used to invite people to his home to sit and let him read to them, and they would experience a text together. And so this is at the center of his, of his biography, of his aesthetic, of the imagery that he portrays. So I agree with you completely. And you mentioned that in a way he gives, in many of his stories, a kind of metatextual roadmap to his readers. This is how you should approach my text, as a garden. And we can think about the reference to the exegetical tradition, the acronym PARTIS, which suggests that the text is a garden which can be entered on several different levels of analysis. And Schulz seems, as you say, to write a text which invites the reader to enter on so many different levels of analysis, as a conversation with European modernism, as a conversation with the philosophy of matter and form, as a conversation with the Jewish historical experience, with the question of Jewish cultural continuity, as an intertextual work, in conversation with other works of Europe, very rarely works of Polish literature, in conversation with works of Mediterranean European tradition, his German language influences, Kafka, Mann, Rilke. And also we can think of these texts as, just to go on with the idea of inviting multiple interpretations, as written to be intentionally translingual. They are written entirely accessible within the language, the discourse of Polish modernism, and entirely accessible within the language of the Jewish modern experience. They can be read in that multilingual Jewish context that we looked at earlier in our conversation. And this polyphony should be sustained. It shouldn't be resolved. It's a kind of a beautiful model of a translingual or polyphonic text that manages to embody the translinguality of its diasporic context in which it's written. And I think he's looking for that. He's searching for models of writing that can do justice to that multilingual diasporic context. So I agree with you. It invites a constantly renewed readings.
I think one of the most interesting things that you showed me, and you were nice enough to show me your work in progress before this, so so I would know what you were, what direction you were going in, and was saying that Schulz is always interested in going inward and downward rather than forward, and I thought that was really a useful way of understanding what Schulz is doing. If I can. I think that's a good note to end on. And I think that, one thing I've asked, all of our guests on the show, especially those who teach, is to say a few words about, about your program so thank you for your insights into Bruno Schulz, revealing maybe another layer of meaning that Schulz aficionados aren't all aware of.
Thank you, David, for allowing us to continue a conversation we've been having over more than a decade. So it's always a huge pleasure to talk with you, and I look forward to more.
So could you say a few words about the Polish program at the University of Illinois Chicago, where you teach? It's an enormous program. It has a lot of funding behind it. There are faculty in many different fields.
We're so lucky at UIC because due to an amazing donation of the Stefan and Lucy Haina Family Foundation over 10 years ago, the University of Illinois at Chicago was able to create a very vibrant Polish studies program in both literature and history. So within the Department of Polish, Russian, and Lithuanian Studies, the literature program is headed by Michał Paweł Markowski, and we focus on modernism, Polish modernism, with an emphasis on philosophy and literature, on Polish Jewish studies, and visual studies. And in the history department, the Polish program is headed by Keely Stouter-Halstead, also focusing on research into Galicia. So we have, Polish language at first couple of years, but our emphasis is really on modern Polish literature and history, and we certainly invite graduate applicants. And, your reviewers should feel free to write to me to ask for more information.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. So it's been great to see you again. I have to thank other people as well.
So good to see you, David.
All right. So we should, of course, thank the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, which is directed by Robert Czaniawski, for suggesting this program and for supporting us and for hosting our video on its YouTube channel. I'd like to thank Bartek Remisko, who is the head of humanities in the literature program at the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, for suggesting the series himself and acting as our executive producer. We should thank Natalia Iudin fellow producer who handles all of the video editing and all of the technical and aesthetic aspects of the program, and Claudia Ofłona-Draber, who is head of communications at the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, who handles publicity for the series and all publicity for the Institute. So let me thank you all for listening and for reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month, when we'll be discussing the work of the great post-war poet and playwright Tadeusz Różewicz with translator and scholar Joanna Czeciak from Kent State University. So thank you, and I'll see you in a month.